Eric's question. Get ready for the deep dive. It's going to be a good one. He says, I started cycling again about Nate just waved. It's
time to go to the bathroom.
Nate's got his bathroom break. He says, I started cycling again about 4 months ago. To give a bit of a background, I cycled competitively as a teenager. And at the time I was very light, about 55 kilograms for 175 centimeters. That's as we call a string bean, right? So that's a person that he mentions when he was younger as a teenager. That's more common to have that sort of build, right? And then as you get older, that changes. He says, I was mostly good at climbing. Every junior is really good at climbing, all those kids. So he says, then I switched to strength training and stuck with that for about 20 years. My numbers reflect this. I can produce 1,200 watts in a sprint. And that's even without going full gas, as I'm afraid to break my carbon frame on the trainer, as I'm a heavy rider at 90 kilograms. So that's 1,200 watts on the trainer. That's quite a lot on the trainer. That's tough to hit. He says, however, my FTP is pretty rubbish at 220 watts, and it only seems to improve in tiny baby steps. Considering I used to be the guy who could do the long sustained effort, but couldn't sprint at all, I was really not explosive back then. Did the 20 years of strength training, with significant time of that being during puberty, shift my muscle fiber makeup from mostly long twitch, or he says slow twitch, to fast twitch is probably a better way to say that. He says, or am I overthinking this? And does it just take a long time to raise FTP, especially if you haven't done endurance training in 20 years? So Chad, this one is a great opportunity to talk about fiber type composition, what we're made of basically, and what all that means. And you've got a lot of fantastic information on it. Where do you want to start?
Well, I'm going to wait for Nate first.
This will be great podcast content. We'll just be quiet for a while. Let him come back.
In order to discuss the concept of fiber type conversion, we have to lay some groundwork here. So I'm going to talk quite a lot about muscle fibers, and a lot of the things will be repeated from what we've discussed in the past, but this is a more consolidated distribution, I guess, of that information. So let's start with what differentiates a slow twitch or an endurance fiber from a fast twitch or a strength fiber. So on the one end of that spectrum, slow twitch fibers are basically low force capacity. They can't push real hard, high fatigue resistance. They can go forever. They favor oxidative metabolism, so aerobic metabolism, and they tend to be smaller fibers. Other end of that spectrum, pretty much the opposite of everything I just described. We have high force capacity, can really push hard, low fatigue resistance, do not last long, favor glycolytic or sugar metabolism, and they tend to be larger fibers. And this kind of reinforces the finding, the observation that there is an inverse relationship between the size of the fiber and its oxidative capacity. So bigger fibers tend to have less endurance, to put it really simply. And this is a bit of a tangent, but we're going to come back to this study a little later by Van Wessel in 2010, where they observed that high oxidative fibers, so fibers that have a lot of aerobic capacity, actually possess a larger capacity for protein synthesis than those fast twitch fibers, yet they remain relatively small. And that's a really fun paper to geek out on, because it actually explains why that is. Why is there this paradox?
Hey, Chad, can I ask you one quick question with this? So there seems to, and sorry, this is going to be a bit of a tangent, but I already see it developing in people's eyes or in people's heads. Slow twitch is very often associated with a specific cadence, like a slower cadence, whereas fast twitch, a lot of people associate it with being faster. And I don't know if this is particularly common in the tri world. That isn't necessarily the case. It isn't like if you have more of one different fiber type composition, you are going to pedal at a specific cadence, correct?
No, it's tied to force output. So I didn't really dip into how twitch relates to that. That is something we can cover at another time, but I'd like to do it justice. But no, sure. that isn't how it works.
It isn't inherently tied, right?
No, it's tied to the amount of force that muscle can output.
Awesome. Cool. Sorry, Chad. Just wanted to nip that one in the bud. I'm sure it was already coming up for some folks. So
sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And I hope to clear that up with some of the descriptions I have ahead.
Cool.
Okay. So let's look at muscle fibers genetically. So what fiber types does our heritage bestow upon us? In other words, we could put this as our muscle fiber genotype. So physiologically, again, what types and what compositions are we born with? And an interesting side note is that human muscle appears to be highly heterogeneous, whereas opposed to animal muscle, a little more homogeneous. So we have quite a mix of different types of fiber, all within the same muscle, whereas animals seem to be a bit more pure in that respect. And all of this is gleaned from roughly 10, 11 studies that I looked at. So we have to take that grain of salt at all times. Not only is it limited to those studies, but it's also limited to my interpretation of those studies. Okay, so how we classify muscle fibers depends on the method, and there are a number of types, a number of different methods, and which method you choose can decide or determine how many gradations or hybridizations of these fibers we're looking at. One of the papers I looked at used a particular method that whittled it down, not exactly, to roughly 20 different types of fibers. So you got your slow, your medium, and your fast twitch. And they had all these inclusions in the spectrums between slow and medium, medium and fast. And that's all good and fine, but it's not really germane to what we're concerned with, because us as athletes tend to focus on the 3 main fiber types. And this is determined, these types are determined by the protein composition. It is that simple. And the term used, or the type of distinction or methodology, is myosin heavy chain isoform. So really, they're just using the myosin. So if you think of the contractile proteins in a muscle fiber, you got myosin inactive. Well, how much myosin it ties strongly to the shortening velocity, or how quickly that muscle can contract. And then the isoform end of that is just saying that it's roughly the same thing, but the proteins in it, the amino acids, might be arranged a little bit differently, or are arranged a little bit differently. So all these things are very similar in nature, but they allow us to create this spectrum. And in particular, with these 3 fibers, we're looking at endurance fibers versus strength fibers, and then the intermediate, which is kind of a strength endurance fiber. Okay. So the endurance fibers are what we refer to as slow twitch, but all of these have a million names. So they're also the type 1 fibers, or the slow oxidative, because they're slow twitch, but they also oxidize fuel, or simply aerobic fibers. Whereas the strength fibers, other end of that spectrum, are the fast twitch, or the type 2Bs, 2X in animals usually. They're the fast glycolytic, fast twitch, and they prefer glycolysis, or simply glycolytic fibers. And then when you marry them, or you find the in-between, there's the strength endurance fibers, and those are the medium twitch, or the 2As, fast oxidative glycolytic, kind of verging more on the fast twitch side of things, but can metabolize both types of fuel, sometimes just called oxidative glycolytic. Moving forward, I'm going to do my best to stick to slow, medium, and fast twitch.
And we thank you for that, Chad.
Yeah, and it conveys everything relevant. It gets it all. Okay, so it's important to recognize that muscle is predominantly 1, typically. And you'll see this described as a preponderance of type whatever fibers, or a predominance of. And while there is evidence of some fibers being pure, most fibers, from what I've gathered from the studies that I looked at, are in fact hybrids. So mixes of. And what's really interesting is this hybridization can actually include all 3 of these fiber types. So within the same muscle, you can have some slow twitch, some medium twitch, and some fast twitch. This is not an unusual thing. It was discovered quite a while ago. I'll describe that a little bit later. Okay, we can also approach this from a different angle, and we can look at a comparison of the types of contractions that take place. So when it comes to strength contractions, these are often labeled tetanic contractions. So I think muscle tetanus, where it stays in a frozen state, because they don't cease until the load is lifted. If you think of a bench press, you don't like push it up a little ways and then back it off, and then push it up and then back it off. You push and push and push until you either lock out, rack the bar, fail, whatever. So they're high force, low speed, and a perfect example is what I just described, a heavy lift. And these rely on recruitment over metabolism to create force. That is the strength of the contraction. Whereas endurance fibers, or endurance contractions, are more bursts of activation. We work and rest, contract and relax. And we do this in the case of cycling with every pedal stroke. And they're lower force, higher speed, and the emphasis is on the frequency of the contraction. So now we're relying on repetition to maintain low levels of intermittent, but persistently so, force. That is the frequency of contraction. So where it gets interesting, and what's especially relevant to bike racers, people who have to compete in mass start events, is what happens when we work a little bit harder, because then we're marrying, or we're verging or combining strength with endurance. We're increasing the force, but we're keeping that same high frequency. So think about threshold repeats, or sweet spot repeats, or even tempo repeats. So anytime we talk about that often misunderstood, or just not understood at all, term muscle endurance or strength endurance, because what we're really describing there is force endurance. These are the fibers that we task with being all things. They do more work. They can deal with shorter recoveries. They have the ability to fuel quickly or basically turn over ATP quickly. And so all of this lays the ground for what we're going to go back to, which is demands, because demands influence adaptation. And in doing so, Eric, this is where we can start talking about fiber type interconversion, which is also referred to as fiber type switching more simply. We'll probably stick with that. So a study by Stephen Hardridge, 2007, titled "The Plasticity of Human Skeletal Muscle, Gene Expression to In Vivo Function." And the title kind of says it all. We're talking all the way from our genetic makeup to how we execute, muscle contractions. And in it, he says, and I quote, "Human skeletal muscle is a highly heterogeneous tissue," basically what I just said, "able to adapt to the different challenges that may be placed upon it." And that's it right there. That we do have the ability to adapt it, but to what extent? So Scott Trapp is another researcher in this field, was quoted as saying in 2012 in an interview with Outside Magazine, "With training, you could probably change your fiber type about 10%. And then the article goes on to paraphrase him and says that most people are born with about 50-50 split of slow and fast twitch muscle fibers. But it's clear that if you're a gifted, my emphasis, endurance athlete or sprinter, that you were probably born with more slow twitch or fast twitch fibers respectively." And what this suggests to me is that this is more a matter of genetics than epigenetics, which well, I'm not saying that the epigenetic influence is nothing, because there's certainly something there, but in at least this researcher's opinion, it's not a heck of a lot, 10%. So then the question becomes, how do we as athletes influence fiber switching? It's really simple, through our actions. And when it comes to athletes, we term that training stimuli, right? So what training stimulus are we inflicting on the muscle? So when we couple genetics with these external influences, and those can range from everything as how will you rest, how will you nourish, how will you hydrate, how you manage your stress, and of course, how you exercise, this manifests in your muscle fiber phenotype. So how we're expressing our genetics. The demands determine the adaptation, the term that we've all heard, gene expression. So shifting a muscle's predominance of fiber type is basically changing one muscle's phenotype to another, or at least shifting it to some degree. And what's interesting here is that genetics can give us really different starting points. And a very good example of this goes back almost, 20 years now, with Golnick, and I think it's pronounced Saltine, but Saltin, whatever. They looked at 9 men, 2 women. They biopsied fibers, stained them, did all that. And in particular, they looked at the soleus, which is a low leg muscle, but it's deep to your more obvious gastrocnemius, which is the other muscle they looked at. And then they looked at one of our quads, which is the vastus lateralis, so the outside quad, which is a big driver when it comes to the pedal stroke. So I'm just going to focus on the soleus and the vastus lateralis. So a low leg muscle and a quadricep upper leg muscle. And the soleus averaged about 80%, or it did average 80% slow twitch, whereas the vastus lateralis averaged 52%. So that doesn't tell us much. It tells us that the soleus is predominantly a slow twitch muscle, which kind of makes sense considering its job. Whereas the vastus lateralis, that quadricep, had a pretty even distribution, which also makes sense. But what was very interesting about this is that the ranges were wide. So with the soleus, that lower leg muscle, they were between 64 and 100% slow twitch, which, okay, so it's either really, mostly slow twitch or very slow twitch. But the vastus lateralis went from 13 to 96%. Whoa. So we're talking about athletes that are incredibly slow twitch versus athletes that are incredibly fast twitch. And with that muscle in particular, they looked at 74 different subjects, observed in the realm of about 16,000 different fibers. So they looked at a pretty good cross section of athletes, people, whatever. But the point is that there are clear differences between athletes. What was unclear about the study, and is a little bit of a bummer, but it is an old study, is that I don't know if that was due to genetic predisposition or epigenetic influence. I don't know if they were born that way or they did things to make them that way. But that study aside, other studies do actually clearly support the notion that we can shift this. And one of those is John Hawley's study from 2002, where he found evidence that demonstrated a change in the ratio of our fast twitch to our medium twitch fibers with endurance training. He also noted, and this was roughly 20 years ago, that at the time there was no longitudinal evidence. So they didn't look at athletes starting here up until, follow them through a point, look at them at a later point. no evidence for fast twitch to slow twitch in already well-trained endurance athletes. So, well-trained, maybe this applies to, maybe sedentary people are different, don't know. But, the question then is, has this changed since 2002? And I don't know, I couldn't find anything. If anyone knows of studies that could elucidate that for me, I'd appreciate it, but I couldn't find anything. But in 2015, Naomi Broker noted, quote, changes in oxidative capacity, so our aerobic capabilities, the muscle's aerobic capabilities, can take place without changes in the MHC isoforms. So basically what she's saying is that it's still a medium twitch or a fast twitch fiber, it just has greater oxidative capacity. So it's still classified the same way, it just has a greater ability for endurance, greater ability to oxidize fuel aerobically. So we can influence this. We can shift fibers that are ostensibly one way or actually one way to be a little more the other way. How do we accomplish this? A fancy way to put it is the pattern of neural stimulation influences changes in type. To put it more simply, it's the nature of the contractions that are going to determine which proteins are going to increase, which signaling cascades are going to kick off. Will it veer endurance or strength? And side note, but it's a personal gripe, but it's also something that I'd like to spare people from wasting their time on, is this whole idea of low weight, high repetition work in the gym. And don't get me wrong, that can work. And there is evidence to show that it can work, that if you push low weight to near failure, actual failure, you can incur hypertrophy, you can incur actual improvements in strength. But for most people, this is some nonsense. And you got to consider why. There's no clear signal being sent. You're not picking up loads that are heavy enough to say, I need stronger muscles. You're not repeating the movement of those loads enough times to say, I need greater endurance. You're not sending a clear signal. You pick up a 5-pound dumbbell and curl it 30 times, and reps 27, 28, 29, and 30 are just as easy as reps 4, 5, and 6. It's not a stimulus. You're not getting anything out of that. So save your time.
You're jacked, Chad. I don't know why you have to attack me like this.
I'm just saying, if you're going to go to a gym and you're going to do things, don't make those things what I just described. And it's not a tangent. This is absolutely related, but this does help us understand a little better why concurrent training yields relatively poor results. When we pit strength against endurance, we're effectively creating this steel cage match between fiber size and oxidative capacity. And to return to that Van Wessel paper that describes this paradox, the paper is titled "The Muscle Fiber Type Paradox: Hypertrophy or Oxidative Metabolism?" ? So it's one or the other. And he notes that high oxidative or slow twitch fibers have a larger capacity for that protein synthesis, yet remain smaller, right? So there's that opportunity to nerd out. But he quotes, a muscle fiber can hypertrophy, get bigger, at the expense of its maximum steady state power. And therein lies the rub for all of us as endurance athletes who want to incorporate strength training into our training. We can trigger muscle to increase mass and strength and increase that hypertrophy. We can trigger muscle to increase fatigue resistance, increase that oxidative or aerobic capacity. But when we combine them, we get lesser increases in both, as opposed to focusing on the one. So just an alternative way to state that is that we're pitting fiber synthesis against mitochondrial synthesis. Of course, with degradation in mind. We're never synthesizing, we're also synthesizing and degrading. If we're heavier on the synthesis, we're in positive balance, vice versa, we're in negative balance, et cetera. But it's fibers versus mitochondria. To state it yet another way, it's the size of the fibers versus the contents of the fibers. So do we want bigger fibers that are capable of more force, or do we want endurance fibers that contain more mitochondria, more capillaries, more aerobic enzymes aimed at helping us repeat lower force repetitions?
Also, yes.
Okay.
Yeses.
Yeah. So with all that in mind, I'm just going to distill down the research consensus. And again, the 10, 11 papers, most of them linked here that I looked at. First off, conversion is limited by the original type. So in my words, predominance reigns supreme. So if you start naturally, genetically as a sprint athlete with a ton of fast twitch fibers, you're probably never going to be the best endurance athlete in the world, and vice versa. So your genetics can absolutely work against you if you decide you want to be something other than what they think you ought to be. Conversion is always, quote, always towards slower types. And I'm going to touch back on that, because what this research is saying is that fast twitch can convert to medium twitch can convert to slow twitch, but fast twitch will never go to slow twitch. This simply doesn't occur. Again, this is consensus. It's not to say there aren't studies out there that demonstrate otherwise, but the consensus is that. Now, the interesting exception to this always slower notion is with deconditioning, or simply unloading. And the trend there is that slow twitch fibers actually become more like fast twitch fibers. They shift their characteristics from oxidative ones to more glycolytic ones. So put another way is your fast twitch fibers increase while your medium twitch and your slow twitch decrease. And conversely, most training, and most training, even strength training, decreases your type 2B or your fast twitch fibers in lieu of typically medium twitch fibers, even to a point where there's actually no presence of type 2B fibers. And I linked to that study because that's yet another one to geek out on. So in terms of deconditioning, Scott Trapp, who I touched on earlier, did a study in 2004 where he looked at the maintenance of muscle function and the composition of the fibers during long periods of unloading, and long periods. In this case, it was 84 days. And it had to do with considering astronauts in a state of weightlessness, but also people who were restricted to bed rest. And the main finding is, as we've talked about many times, doesn't take much. Very little maintenance is actually required. And as we know, it's pretty easy to work in. So in the case of these, not even athletes, these subjects that were subjected to 84 days of bed rest, all they had to do was 4 sets of 7 max reps, to as hard as they could push every third day. So we're talking less than 30 reps every third day. So on average, 10 reps a day, not much work. With the ones who actually did the exercise, they didn't see changes. Their muscles stayed the same size. They maintained relatively the same function. Everything stayed really similar. But the people who were on full bed rest totally tanked, just as we might expect. But what's interesting is that prior to the bed rest, both groups had minimal hybrid fibers. They only had about 13%. Everything else was reasonably pure, I guess. Post study, the bed rest group increased to 49%. So now they're like 50, half of their fibers are hybrid fibers, whereas the group with exercise increased to about 31%, which is interesting in and of itself, but it shows even inactivity can cause a shift in fiber type. What's also interesting is that bed rest group, this was the first study, and I touched on this earlier, to report slow twitch, medium twitch, and fast twitch fibers. So all the fiber types in the same muscle. And then with both groups, whether it was the bed rest or the bed rest with a little bit of strength work, the hybrids came at the expense of the slow twitch fibers. So we had slow twitch to increasingly glycolytic conversions. Why? Because that's how they're being used. I mean, there's no need for oxidative capacity. They're not doing anything that even vaguely mimics endurance work. And only the bed rest group was doing something that, though strength work, was still probably more veering toward endurance work. But the point is that demands dictate the fiber characteristics. A final side note, and this is just something I wanted to cover, but I figure there's probably already enough information to process as it is that there is evidence, and I linked 2 studies, that fiber typology, our fiber composition, can impact both our rate of recovery when it comes to high intensity training and the incidence of overreaching and how we supercompensate. And I linked to both those papers because I'm not saying pigeonhole yourself and say, oh, I'm mostly a fast twitch athlete, this is always going to be my plight. That's not necessarily the case, but these are a couple of papers that should provide some good food for thought. So my conclusion, Eric, is that based on the research, the 10, 11 papers I looked at, is you probably have the same level of influence you always had. If you have it at one point, you probably still have it. I don't know why it would go away. And any so-called damage to your endurance capacity can be reduced with training. You just have to do the work. So if you're improving in your performance capabilities by, small upticks here and there, I'm thinking it's something else. There may be a fiber type influence, but I really don't think that's what you need to concern yourself with.
I mean, the majority of us improve in small increments, do we not? I mean, that's how it works. When you first start training, you might have, a big ramp up and rapid improvement, but then over time, it always becomes more incremental. So that's, somewhat to be expected. So Chad, to recap, the fast twitch, slow twitch, medium twitch fibers, your muscles can be composed of all 3. And you can shift them, but it's really you're a product of your environment, the training that you're doing. But that doesn't mean that you do irreversible change. You can change it back as well over time within reason.
Plasticity. Plasticity is the term. And what changes you can make aren't going to be huge ones. So don't bank on the fact that your training is going to turn you into a very different athlete from what you are right now. You can emphasize strengths and you can train weaknesses, but you're probably not going to completely flip-flop in terms of one type of athlete into another.
That's great news for a lot of us athletes that probably heard this and think like, oh, well, I am that type of rider. And we tend to put ourselves in a box because of this. That's good news that we can.
Well, and as importantly, I mean, what Scott Trapp says is that we're all basically starting from a 50-50 point anyways. That's where we are. So we can kind of shift that one way or the other with our training. So it's really unlikely that anyone, well, I won't say really unlikely, but it's less common that people are distinctly one thing. I mean, Usain Bolt's probably never going to be a Tour de France climber, right? And Roman Bardet is probably never going to outsprint Usain Bolt. So those are extremes on that spectrum, but most of us fall more toward the middle.
That's a great visual, by the way. Just thinking Roman Bardet sprinting against Usain Bolt.
Wout van Aert, though, thinking about what he did in the Tour, which is crazy. Like he can sprint and he can do extremely long climbs, which just does not make sense.
It's amazing. I think the only outstanding question after all of covering all of that, Chad, is Nate, where are you and I going to go to get our muscle biopsies?
I just asked in the chat. I don't know. Somebody, I keep asking.
If you're listening to this and you have an avenue to get us in to get some muscle biopsies, please let us know. We'd be interested in finding out our fiber type composition and just seeing what that is. It'd just be an interesting point of note. And Chad, you're going to come too, right?
Sure, I'll go. I'm not going to get a biopsy.
Scary. If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.